there's something you should know about me, it's that I love data. Now I know what you're thinking, a TED Talk about data and data collection, admittedly not a very sexy topic. But ultimately, I think data is really just a collection of individual stories that come together to tell a collective story. And we all love stories. Today I want to talk to you about home, belonging, and acceptance, and about the stories that data can tell us about who is included and who isn't. Let me start with my story. I'm originally from Bolivia, and I grew up, yes, all around the world, but when I was 15, I moved to the United States. And I had always heard when I was a kid that the US was this big, beautiful melting pot of different races and ethnicities and cultures, and that everyone was accepted and could fit in. So I was really excited to move there. But when I got there, I realized that my lived reality of that promise was going to be different. I was one of the few immigrant students in a mostly white school. And with my long, dark hair, my tan skin, and a name like Maria Fernanda, I was immediately racialized as Latina. And I found out that that meant I was seen as other. I did not see any examples of people who looked like me in our textbooks or assigned novels. In US history classes, we would only learn about European immigrants and their experiences. My teachers always made comments about how exotic I was. And there were even a couple times when kids in classrooms would tell me to go back to Mexico. Now, although I did find this geographic ignorance about the distance between Bolivia and Mexico rather amusing, the jokes still hurt. And although I did eventually make friends, I realized that I was always going to be seen as the foreign Latina kid. So I had been led to believe that the US was this beautiful, colorblind melting pot. But that narrative did not capture my experience in school. And so I became obsessed with this question of identity, of collective identity. What story do we tell ourselves about who we are, and who is included in that narrative of us? This question led me to study education policy at Harvard with a focus on racial and ethnic inequality. And as I studied inequality in public policy, I realized that my question was getting more specific. I was interested in how historically homogeneous communities include new forms of diversity. How are these new diverse communities integrated, if at all, into a collective sense of who belongs? Now, my professors kept bringing up Europe as this beacon of hope and social progress, especially with increasing diversity. And so I became really curious about Europe's approaches to integration. Now, migration has always been a part of Europe's history. After World War II, there was a big wave of migration as Western European nations called for help from guest workers from abroad to come help and revive the economy. And policymakers expected that these guest workers would eventually leave when the program ended in the 70s. But actually, a lot of them chose to stay. They had been here for a while, they called their families, they already called this place home, and so they stayed. And then more recently, we've also seen a wave of immigrants and asylum seekers taking refuge in Europe. This is an example from Germany. And most of these communities come from outside of Western Europe and therefore look more noticeably different from the populations that they're immigrating into. And yet, national identity in Europe historically has mostly relied on ancestry or ethnic heritage. That might mean language, culture, religion. And so Europe is now facing an identity crisis. With all this new diversity, what narrative do we tell about who belongs in Europe now? I moved to Germany in 2020 to learn about how Europe approaches diversity and inclusion. And what I found is that most conversations about DEI in Europe tend to focus on gender equality. Now, obviously, we're at a women's conference. This is obviously a really important topic. And yet, whenever I would ask about, well, what about the women of color? I was always met with this comment of, oh, you Americans are so obsessed with race. Racism is an American problem. We don't have that problem here. Now, this is, of course, not true. Racism exists everywhere. Europe, and especially Germany, has a long and complex history with race-based discrimination. And yet, perhaps precisely because of this history, it is too charged of a topic to bring up and discuss. And so I find that people in Europe are more willing to talk about gender equality precisely because they can take a colorblind approach. And you might have heard about this colorblind philosophy before. If I don't see color, I believe there's just one race, the human race. And that is a well-intentioned thought. But when we use this way of seeing the world to design policy and interact with each other, it can actually be harmful. And the reason it's harmful is that it's not true. It's a myth. Our brains obviously do see color. We do recognize differences. And that means that even if we don't like admitting it, a lot of us end up developing an unconscious or implicit association with certain groups over others. Harvard has this project Implicit, where they designed tests that will measure these unconscious attitudes and beliefs. And one of these tests specifically measures whether somebody has a positive or negative association with Black faces. And here's the results for Europe. This map shows that every country in Europe has a negative association with Blackness. The red countries show more bias, and the blue countries have slightly less bias, but there was no country that had zero bias or even positive bias. And the same was true for the US. So yes, it's true that the US has a problem with racism, but so does Europe, even if it's not talked about as much. And we see the impact of those unconscious biases in the lived experiences of ethnic minorities in Europe. In a survey of young people in 12 EU nations, they found that about 40% of all Black, Muslim, and Roma people experience discrimination in their daily lives due to their ethnic heritage, religion, or skin color. And so what this data shows us is that we do see color, we do recognize differences, and people are experiencing discrimination because of it. This philosophy of colorblindness, and that we can try to treat people regardless of their background or regardless of their skin color, treat everyone the same. It's a nice thought, but it's not working. You can't think away racism. So I can see that initially this thought of colorblind approaches to inclusion might sound appealing. For example, there's a lot of companies now that are taking this approach of blind hiring or anonymous applications where they remove all identifying factors from a candidate's profile. Or even in the US, there's a big movement now to remove race as a consideration in college admission decisions. And I can understand that initially this sounds like a good thing, right? You're trying to assess people based on their skills, and it aligns with our democratic ideals of equality for all. But this assumes that everybody starts out on an equal footing in life, which is not true. In reality, some people do start out with less, and therefore that means they might encounter more obstacles or need more support in order to arrive at an equal level of opportunity. And so when we are reading colorblind applications, we're assessing people without seeing any of the discrimination or additional struggles they may have faced before their application even gets to your desk. And not collecting comprehensive race and ethnicity data is also dangerous because it makes it hard to know what the specific needs of each community are. And that means that we're not able to take targeted approaches to help them with the challenges that they might face in public services like education or housing or employment or healthcare or the criminal justice system. And that is dangerous because then it means that some communities become invisible and perpetually underserved. And sometimes it might even mean that their lives are in danger. There was a study done by a group of criminologists in Germany that found that there were strong trends of ethnic minorities experiencing police violence, systemic police violence, due to racial and ethnic profiling. However, because police reports don't actually capture race and ethnicity data, there's no way to systematically analyze this for the broader population. This was just a small study. And that means with the lack of evidence, it's really difficult to build a case for how to take action and create systemic change. And color-conscious approaches to data inclusion are not only important for ethnic minorities. The UK did a race disparity audit a couple years ago, and they found that Roma children are falling behind their peers in education. But when they looked at poor children, they saw that white students were actually performing the lowest in school. And so having this race and ethnicity data allowed researchers, policymakers, and educators to realize that not only did minority Roma children need more support, but so did poor white children. And unless we had that disaggregated data, that community would have gotten lost in the mix. And not only is this important for the public sector. In the private sector, I know a lot of businesses are struggling with this idea of creating a collective identity and creating a workplace where everybody feels that they belong. And a lot of business leaders will cite data privacy policies like GDPR as something that prevents them from collecting ethnicity data. And it's true that it makes it more difficult, but it's not impossible. I've done it. In the last company I worked at in Germany, we did collect race and ethnicity data. And what we found is that when we disaggregated that data, we could define our problem more specifically. Our problem was actually not so much in terms of hiring for diversity, it was that our promotion rates were not distributed equally across ethnic groups. Specifically, our Asian women and Black employees in general were being passed over for promotions into leadership roles. And so once we had a more defined problem, it gave us a direction to design training and support that our community needed. But why is it important to gather disaggregated data? Why can't we use this collective term of migrants, this aggregate term that a lot of European nations use? Well, I see three reasons why that's an issue. The first is that there are a lot of people of color in Europe who were born here, and therefore they wouldn't be captured by this term migrant, and they still experience discrimination based on their race and ethnicity. So what do we do with that? The second reason is that even within this term of migrant, there are vastly different experiences. So for example, researchers found that across the EU, opinions about allowing Ukrainian refugees into the country were starkly different from those about Syrian refugees. And so this difference in public opinion means that even within the category of migrants, people have different experiences based in terms of acceptance and belonging based on how they are perceived. And unless we have that disaggregated data, it's hard to know which community is more at risk. And lastly, the third issue, and I think this is the main issue with why it's an issue to use this proxy, migrants, instead of using ethnicity or race. I believe that Europe's insistence on using this aggregate category is based on this assumption that ethnic minorities are temporary. There's still this mindset that they'll eventually go back where they came from and that they don't need to be integrated into the collective sense of national identity. But we need to recognize that these communities are no longer migrants. They're here to stay, and they call this place home too. I started today talking about acceptance and belonging and how comprehensive demographic data can help us get there. The data we gather and the stories that we tell with it matter. They matter because data can be used to control the narrative of who belongs, but data can also be used to empower, to make people feel included and seen as part of a community. Our discomfort with talking about race is preventing us from collecting necessary disaggregated race and ethnicity data. But migrants like me want to feel accepted and have equal access to opportunity without having to lose parts of ourselves in the process. I was introduced to you today as MK, but my full name is actually Maria Fernanda Quiriguindia Romero. When I moved to the US and I tried to fit into that colorblind melting pot narrative, I allowed my name to be whitewashed into the shorter and more palatable Maria Kerrigan. And I went by that name for years. But as I started healing and reclaiming my heritage and my identity, this name started tasting funny in my mouth. It felt strange. And so I changed it again, this time to MK. And I think I'm gonna need to stop moving around because I can't go any shorter than that. But frankly, I'm tired of having to cut off pieces of myself in order to fit in to the places that I migrate to. I've worked really hard on reclaiming my Latina identity, And I don't want it to be erased through colorblind approaches to inclusion. I want you to see me for all of me, not just my gender. And I don't want you to accept me despite my identity, but because of it. I'm proud of my heritage. As it stands, I think colorblind approaches to inclusion and data collection are a convenient way to maintain sameness while using the excuse of equality. But maybe it's time we start expanding our narrative about who belongs in our communities, starting with the data we collect about the people who call this shared place home. Thank you.